Jesus. He drew to him many Jews and Gentiles. At the suggestion of Jewish leaders, Pilate had him condemned to death on a cross. This quote is from Flavius Josephus, a Roman historian from the 1st century. It's a non-Christian source that confirms Jesus' death in Jerusalem. An historical event which took place around the year 33 Anno Domini, according to many archaeological texts and research. However, the Passion of Jesus raises other questions that books don't answer. Why did the Romans resort to this type of torture? What effect does flagellation have on the body? Is it possible that Jesus could have carried the cross, weighing almost 90 pounds, after having been tortured? Can a person sweat blood? What was the final cause of Jesus' death? Doctors and specialists share key findings about Jesus of Nazareth's last day. The Passion of Jesus, a medical investigation. One of the most basic elements for investigating the most well-known death by crucifixion is here in Turin, in northern Italy. It's called the Holy Shroud, and it has an imprint of a man, around 30 or 40 years old, nearly 6 feet tall. The imprint indicates the presence of multiple wounds on the corpse. The linen fabric has been publicly worshipped since the 14th century, when it was almost completely destroyed by a fire in a chapel in Chambéry, France. Today, the burn marks are still visible. At the end of the 16th century, it was transported to Italy, where it's been venerated in the Turin Cathedral. Since then, it's been an important object for the city. However, it was only at the end of the 19th century that the shroud unveiled something extraordinary. The negatives from the first photograph of the shroud revealed important information about the man it had covered. The realistic design, which can only be seen in the negative, led hundreds of scientists to analyze it in great detail. New technologies help aid the investigations. For decades, there have been chemical, biological, anatomical, and medico-legal studies, one after another. A carbon dating test placed the shroud's creation somewhere in the 13th and 14th centuries, seemingly ruining its credibility. This method was later questioned when it was revealed that the results differed depending on the location, on the shroud, of the fibers being analyzed.
There is a disparity within the data that depends on the distance between the fragment of the Holy Shroud being analyzed and the border of the shroud. This difference suggests the shroud underwent some type of unknown contamination. We don't know what kind of contamination. This caused a linear rejuvenation that was impossible to remove at the time they were dating it. It could not be removed when they were figuring out the shroud's date of origin. What does this mean? It does not mean that the shroud is necessarily from the 1st nor the 19th century. It simply means that the results of the attempt to determine the shroud's date of origin, or at least the interpretation of the results, cannot be considered definitive. The important thing to remember is that this test cannot be considered definitive.
New technologies have brought surprising and inexplicable scientific characteristics to light. Nello Ballasino, a computer science professor at the University of Turin, is among the experts who have analyzed the fabric.
Its characteristics arise from the fact that the image is right on the surface of the linen. It doesn't break any of the fabric's fibers. The flax fibers are still intact. They have the characteristic of being three-dimensional. The coloration explains this, but contrary to what people think, the different coloration is not due to the fact that some fibers are darker or lighter than others. The different coloration, the light and dark intensity on the shroud, is due to the density of fibers in any given area. It's due to the number of fibers concentrated in a given section. So, if there are more fibers of a certain color in one place, it gives the impression of darkness. If there are fewer fibers, it gives the impression that the surface is lighter.
The Holy Shroud's three-dimensionality allows sculptors to produce carvings that recreate the man it covered. In 2019, after years of investigations, Italian sculptor Sergio Rodella presented his work, which contains the exact marks from the shroud. If someone wanted to simulate the shape of a body and place it where it's bled, they would first draw the body and add the blood to correct locations later. Here, the opposite is true.
Another fundamental characteristic of the Holy Shroud is that under the bloodstains on the linen, there are no prints. This means the bloodstain was formed first. Only later did the imprints appear.
Professor Nello Balasino hasn't found answers to one final peculiarity of the Holy Shroud either.
A third unique characteristic of the Holy Shroud is that behind the imprint, no marks are visible. The mark is on the surface with three-dimensional characteristics produced by a phenomenon we can't explain. However, it's a phenomenon that occurs only after the cloth has absorbed the blood. In every simulation, the exact opposite is observed. First, we try to reproduce the trace on the shroud. This is done by marking the flax fibers with different methods. Then the blood is added. With any other method, we wouldn't have been able to draw it.
Chemical analyses have shown that the blood belongs to someone with blood type AB.
This blood actually behaved like blood. We observed this on the back of the cloth when we had the chance to examine it. It was a very unique occasion. In 2002, we had the opportunity to see it. Normally, the shroud is sewn onto a different, more modern fabric, so you can't see the back of it. The fact is that the blood stains did indeed penetrate the back area of the shroud, as is normal with any liquid. The body marks, however, are only on the surface. They are visible only on the front of the cloth.
Even with the newest technologies, experts wonder how it's possible to create a three-dimensional image without leaving the residue of paint, a feat that has not been repeated.
Every form of research has gone through quite a notable transformation over time, and it's all come to the same conclusion. What conclusion? It's been decided that it's not possible to know where the fabric comes from, only that it's probably not from the medieval period. This conclusion was reached thanks to the scientific activity that is developed in different fields, ranging from biology and medicine to chemistry and computer science. Investigations in all of these fields unanimously conclude that the marks on the fabric have not been tampered with.
The appearances on the fabric match impressively well with what the Gospel says about the Passion of Christ. This text, which narrates Jesus' life, adheres to what non-religious testimonies and historians of that time say about his life.
I believe that perhaps there are two very important non-Christian testimonies that speak about the passion and death of Christ. First is that of Tacitus, which talks about Nero's persecution of Christians. Tacitus says Nero persecutes Christians because they follow a sect of a certain Christ who was sentenced to death under Roman law. Thus, he speaks concretely about Christ's death. Then there is also Suetonius. He says Claudius expels the Jews from Rome because they are divided among themselves because of Christ.
Professor Bernardo Estrada provides a strong argument, even for those who doubt the historical legitimacy of the Gospels.
If they had been false narratives, only one of the manuscripts would be true, thus betraying the others. Instead, we find a surprising harmony between all of them. You find this even more in the story of the Passion told in the Gospels. The four Gospels essentially tell us the same story. The story's more or less the same. Each Gospel has different details, not found in the others. If the authors of the Gospels had decided to perfectly match up their stories to make everything add up, that would have proven them not historical.
Texts on the Passion agree that Jesus of Nazareth was captured in this area, the Garden of Olives, in front of Jerusalem's walls. Here, he retired to pray and spent his final hours surrounded by his disciples, before being captured by the Jewish authorities. Since they were subject to the Roman Empire, the Jews could not execute the inmate on their own. Thus, the torture Jesus suffers conforms to the rules of foreign power. This is data that contributes to the complete medical documentation of a case that begins with scourging, continues with the crowning of thorns, the carrying of the cross on the way of Calvary, and culminates in the crucifixion. When analyzing the effects of the Passion, Jay Zimmer, a biology professor at Gardner-Webb University, points out that a Jew at that time would have walked everywhere.
There's one estimate I read that he probably walked on an average of 25 miles a day. And so I think he was in very good shape. I also think his diet was very robust, eating a lot of olives, olive oil, fresh fish, fresh bread, fruits, nuts. He was in very good state of health.
Along with a robust diet, he was around 30 years old and worked as a craftsman, likely a carpenter. This combination leads to the possibility that he was a very healthy man. Before the Passion, there's a very important medical fact that shouldn't be overlooked. The protagonist, even before Holy Thursday, knew he was going to be killed. According to Professor Jay Zimmer, biologist at the University of Gardner-Webb, this would have had a tremendous psychological impact.
After the Last Supper, he went to the Mount of Olives, the Garden of Gethsemane, which literally means olive press. And he knew he was going to be crucified from what we see in Scripture. So he was well aware of that. So the anticipation of that horrific death was probably weighing on him heavily.
The Gospel tells of one of Jesus' previous trips to Jerusalem during Passover when he was just 12. It's likely he went often.
He probably partook of maybe 20 Passovers or more. And part of the Passover ritual was the sacrificial lamb. And in my opinion, at some point, he probably realized that, wow, I will be the sacrificial lamb. And when he was approached, when he went to John the Baptist, when he was baptizing at the very beginning of his ministry, one of the first things John the Baptist said was, "Behold, the Lamb of God." And he was not at all shocked by that. So he seemed very attuned to the fact that he was going to die.
It's because of this that Jesus' physical and mental conditions are pushed to the limit when he faces the Passion.
Probably when he just finished the Last Supper. And that was probably the last food that he partook of. And it was probably not a large quantity of it. And from this point on, he was probably not given any water. So we see the beginning of dehydration, especially with the profound sweating that was occurring with him. His nervous system would have been activated to a high level with the autonomic nervous system, with the sympathetic division, like I mentioned. And heart rate probably was accelerated. Circulation of his blood was probably heightened at this time also.
It was under these circumstances that an extraordinary medical phenomenon presented itself. Professor Jay Zimmer had studied the case of Jesus sweating blood and has found other similar cases.
Yes, it's rare. Approximately 80 cases have been confirmed in recent times of sweating blood. They call it hematidrosis. There's numerous names for it. And that can occur. There have been instances of people that have been sweating blood and for months and months at a time, And then they go into a hospital, and in the hospital they're able to examine them. And during their stay in the hospital, some of these patients have had multiple episodes where they were sweating blood.
Dr. Paolo Marianeschi is another doctor who's investigated the strange event of sweating blood. In his opinion, it's necessary to consider another possibility.
St. Luke from the Gospel doesn't just talk about the bleeding. No, he doesn't just talk about the bleeding. He talks specifically about the thrombi of blood. That is, he specifically mentions blood clots. He talks about them as if they were leaving the pores of Jesus' forehead and body, as if he could see them leaving his forehead and body. He talks about blood clots. Considering that Luke was a doctor, which means he was very observant and attentive to what he saw, as doctors are, and that he could also accurately reflect what he saw, this observation suggests that sweating blood was a unique phenomenon that didn't happen often.
Using this information as a starting point, it's necessary to analyze under what circumstances a person can reach this degree of internal pressure.
It occurs in this moment of incredible mental trauma. In fact, he realizes maybe in that moment, or at some other point in the garden, at some point during the agony in the garden, he realizes how difficult it is to carry out the will of the Father. The will of the Father, which is the will of facing death for the salvation of mankind. So, because he is a man, he logically fights against himself to avoid this really immense suffering. This makes perfect sense. This makes perfect sense for anyone who believes this hematidrosis was caused by mental stress.
When Jesus is captured in the Garden of Olives, he is brought before the Sanhedrin, the highest-ranking group of decision-makers among the Jews. Then, he is transferred to the palace of Roman Governor Pontius Pilate, who would be the one to have him executed. For the Romans, death by crucifixion was always preceded by torture. This is certified by historians of the time. Professor Alessia Muliere, expert on ancient Roman traditions, confirms this.
Dionysius of Halicarnassus provided important information about Roman crucifixions. They were always preceded by another form of torture, flagellation. For Romans, there was no set number of blows they were allowed to give. The body of the condemned would always end up covered in lashes. However, they tried not to hit the chest area because they didn't want the prisoner to die before he was supposed to. The goal was to lengthen the martyrdom. It was supposed to be a really atrocious, agonizing death.
Dr. Greg Vieman of the Jefferson Medical College of Philadelphia has dedicated years to the study of the Passion of Christ. To understand this event better, he has a replica of the flagellum Romans used to hit their prisoners.
The Roman whip, or a flagellum, had a wooden handle, and it had anywhere from 6 to 10 leather straps on it. And at the end of those straps, there were lead weights, and there were also pieces of bone and even glass. And so there was a lot of power and force behind it. And they would, lash the backs and the sides of the people. And between the force of the hand, the weight, and then the sharp objects at the end, you would get multiple injuries at once, both superficial and deep.
This instrument of punishment, especially with the sharp objects at the end of the leather, has devastating consequences on the skin. Its effects can be demonstrated by hitting a cardboard box.
So when it first hits, the lead weights will cause contusions and bruising. The pieces of glass and bone would tear into the skin, superficially beginning to cause bleeding. But then as the Roman lictor continued to hit and hit, it would go deeper and deeper into the subcutaneous tissues, into the muscle tissues, where you would get a lot more pain and even a significant amount of bleeding, because now you're getting into small arteries and vessels that will really begin to bleed a lot. And we know historically that they got deep enough to even puncture the lungs and to cause the internal intestines to come out, where they would whip around the side and rip it out. There has Eusebius, the church historian, describes scenes where the guts would come out of people from the whip.
It's not difficult to imagine the tremendous pain caused by this method of torture. Professor Jay Zimmer explains why.
We have different layers of the skin. In the skin proper, we have the epidermis on top, which is of a lighter tissue, epithelial tissue. Below that is a little thicker layer called the dermis. And in animals, that can be preserved to make what we call the hide or leather. So that part was pretty strong. Whipping on the skin, superficially, even if the skin was not broken, it would have caused a tremendous amount of pain. High density of pain receptors in the skin. There's quite a few blood vessels very close to the surface, so it wouldn't take very many strokes with the whip to break open the skin and to cause some bleeding.
This type of torture left terrible imprints on the skin. Forensic doctor Stefano Zacca specializes in analyzing any marks left on a corpse, even from a photograph.
The marks are highly evident, especially on the back. However, they are not only on the back, but also on the lower joints and the legs. The areas with more marks, where there are more blows, match perfectly with the flagellum, the Roman whip they used in that time period. These are the rounded areas with a thicker stroke, which are perfectly compatible.
The maximum number of lashes in Jewish tradition is 39. However, in Roman jurisdiction, there were no limits. Dr. Zacca believes, unfortunately, that the Roman rule was applied.
It has more marks than would be allowed by law. There are more marks than would be expected.
Painters and sculptors depict Jesus wearing a crown of thorns. This is also something forensic examinations have identified in the shroud.
For example, we see lesions at the nape of the neck and forehead that are compatible with those produced by a crown of thorns. There is blood extending in different directions, which matches up with how the head would have moved and flexed on the cross. In any case, it's a deeply moving image, even from an anatomical perspective.
Some believe the artistic idea of the crown of thorns does not match the torture that Jesus suffered. However, Dr. Marionette